Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Oh goodness. So we're going to get started. We really do appreciate the fact that we're between you guys and lunch, so we recognize that. But I can promise you that this is going to be very engaging. Steve, who's going to be sharing his experience with us, he has a lot of context of what their pains were, what their outcomes were, what they went through to scale this up to a really large audience. So without any further ado, I'll welcome Steve to the stage and have him jump right into his presentation today.
All right. All right. So Steve Rossell from American Pacific Mortgage. I am their database administrator, and to kind of give you some context around why we call it small but scrappy, I am our support team. So we rolled everything out with me and one report developer who is no longer with the company. So, all right. So basically what I'm going to be going over is some of the policies and procedures that we used to automate as much as we could so that I didn't have to constantly be in Domo updating users, updating groups, managing PDPs, any of that. So we wanted to be able to do this within a very short time frame. We had a immediate project that had to be out within a couple months. So that was kind of our test bed for all of this. And then of course within a year we had it to our entire organization. So when I say our entire organization, right now we have over 2,400 users. That obviously adjusts daily. We're a mortgage company. So we have branches that come on board, branches that leave. So our turnover in any given week could be 30 to 40 people coming in or out. And so that's a lot for one person to have to manage on a daily basis. Right now we have over 250 individual branches that are in Domo every day. And with that, we've got going out to them, we have over 30 separate pages and subpages to all of our users. And there's over 300 cards right now that we've built. We've had Domo for a little over 2 years, and this is what we got to in 2 years. So how did we do it? So the first thing we did was we had to identify what was going to be our project process. How are we going to handle all these new requests that were coming in? And we used, again, our first push, which was to our branch managers. So they wanted a dashboard that helped them drive their business every day, every week, so that they could see what was going on and they could make changes on the fly. So what we did was we said, okay, give us a list of users. We identified all our users. We created a group in Domo, and then we add users to that group. So we do all of this through the API. Nothing is done in Domo itself except for create one group each time. And we try to recycle groups. So if we have a group that already exists for branch managers and we have a new product going to branch managers, we're just going to use that group. We don't build anything new. We only do it when we have a new process. So we identified all the business units that needed their own group, created all those groups, and then through the API we can pull the group ID number. And that's what we use to then take all our users and add them into whatever groups we need. Second thing we did was we said, okay, you're going to have to create a project page now. That project page was done by our editors. So we made sure that our users had the ability to build. Somebody who was a subject matter expert in that department would build the page and the cards. So they would be doing that at the same time we're doing on our end all of the user stuff. The third thing we did was PDPs. We would ask them, what kind of PDPs do you need? In the case of our branch managers, obviously if you're running a branch, you don't want a different branch to see your numbers. Technically, within our company, all our branches are competing against each other. So they want to be number one. And there's prizes and things that they get. They have a big president's club. So of course, I want to be number one. So we told them, identify your PDPs. What's that going to be? Is it going to be your branch number? Is it going to be your user ID? Is it going to be a region? Whatever that is, identify all of that and give that to us. So then all three of these things would happen at the same time. When we were ready to go, we would apply it all to our page. And at that point, all we had to do was tell the project manager, everything on the back end is ready. All you have to do at this point is share the page to the group, and their permissions are ready to go. So that allowed them to quickly deploy any new project in a very short time frame. So how did we do all of this? First thing we did, data standardization. So we have a mess when it comes to our users. So when I came in and I looked at what we had, I said, all right, we've got information in ADP. We have information in Active Directory. We have information in 4 different applications that are being used. how do I link all this data so that I can manage my groups, manage my users, and manage their permissions. So what I did was I just identified the key points across each one and used those to get a standard data table. Then I went in and I learned everything I could learn about the Domo APIs. I don't know if any of you were in the last session of the day where they were talking about the APIs. I highly recommend, if you're willing to get into something a little more advanced, learn the Domo APIs. You can do a lot of management through this, and you never have to go into Domo itself. So I use it for two things. I use it for user management and group management, and then I'm doing that through the API, and then I'm a SQL Server database administrator, so I use SSIS. So a lot of what you'll see in here is how I formatted things to work within an SSIS package. You don't have to do it that way. As you'll notice from any of the other sessions, if you were in the Domo API session, you'll notice that you can do it through an SDK, you can do it through JavaScript, there's multiple ways you can do it. This happens to be the way that I did it. And then of course, what we did was we identified key metrics. So the other part of it was I got our project manager to take on a project and say, give me the 25 top metrics from all the business units that they share across the company. So once they got that, we identified what the definition of those metrics were so that we could build that into Domo from day one. And then that allowed us to say there's no more silos. If you're trying to get what your application to funded rate is, it's the same. Doesn't matter what dashboard you're on or what card you're looking at, that metric is the same. So we identified these three things to try and speed up our time to deploy. So, optimizing the data sources. The first thing that I did was the Domo user list. So, in the API, you can pull out all of your users. So what I did is I started with, we had our test group that we manually created. We had about 25 users in that group. So I used the API to pull just those 25 users, and what I did was pulled every field that they made available in the API. I pulled all those fields, I created a table and a database. I followed that up by doing the same thing through a PowerShell script with Active Directory. So I took my Active Directory and I pulled out 42 fields from Active Directory, put it in the same database in a different table. Then I went and I pulled the group list, so I knew what I was gonna get from each group. So I had the group ID, the group name, and all the other fields from the API. Following all that up, I created, using Active Directory and also ADP, which I forgot to put on here, but using the two sources, I created one list. And that list I used using, we have function category in our ADP, we also have job title, we have location, and we have a couple other fields. So I created what I called a source group list, and it identified one group for each one of those categories. I used all of those to then say, okay, what is going to be our filter, and then I followed that up with a filtering data set. So when I say a filtering data set, obviously being a mortgage company, we have about 25 to 30 fields that it doesn't matter what job you do, you're probably gonna filter by it at some point. You might say, I wanna filter by the branch, I might wanna filter by the underwriter, or any number of other key fields. Maybe the loan program, I want only VA loans. So what we did is we said, okay, what are those fields? We put them in one data set. So that way we had one data set that we could link back in Domo to any of our data sets we wanted to add on those filtering. That way when they did their page filtering, or in our case, since we're on the interaction filters, when they wanted to do it, it worked no matter where you were at. So we put all of that in there, and then we created a PDP data set. We said, all right, now how are we gonna do our PDPs? Because obviously, we have 2,500 users. And believe it or not, we right now have over 7,000 PDPs across all of our data sets. In order to create the PDPs, what we did is we looked at the API, and we looked at the SDK, and we said, okay, we can take, and we only have to create a couple of columns. Those 4 columns that were important for us were the policy name, what was gonna be the filter column, what's the filter value, and what's the user group that's gonna be in there. In our case, the user group is usually gonna be the individual group that you're trying to put into it. Most of our PDPs are user-based, not group-based, but there are a few that are group-based. So we built this out, and then what we did is within the data warehouse, within the database, I created a process that would then go through our single source of truth on users, and it would say, what is your job title? Based on your job title, I'm adding you to this group in the PDPs. What is your location? Based on your location, you're getting added to this group. So it automatically updates this table for me based on new users being added to Active Directory or our ADP. So it takes those values, puts them in the right groups, or in the right PDPs on this table. So then, once I had all my data cleaned and I had everything in one database, then I went back into the API and I said, now it's time to figure out how we're gonna make all this flow. And so the first thing I did was, again, like I mentioned, get the users out of there. So I pull all the user information from Domo, I put it back into the data warehouse, I'm comparing that against my source table, which is my source of truth. That allows me to make sure that my reference table, which is my source table, is up to date. I take that Domo user ID and I'm adding it to my table. So on my table for one user, I have all of their application user IDs, I have their Domo user ID, I have their associate ID from ADP, I have their SAM account name from Active Directory, I have their email address that's in Active Directory. The key reason why I have the email address is because we use Okta, and so we have to make sure that the email address they're logging in with is the one that Okta is gonna look for. So we put all of that information in there, and then we said, all right, now we need all the groups. So we had built out these groups in Domo, and so we pull them all out, and we store them to say, here's what our active groups are. We have about 50, a little over 50 groups right now, and in those groups, we know the ID number for that group. So when I wanna add users to it through the API, I don't necessarily have to go searching through the group and figure out which one it is. I can just say, give me the group ID for the underwriters. Pull that group ID and link it back in. So all of this is on a master list. I have 4 or 5 different tables that store the data. It's all being processed and put into one table to allow me to process the data. So when you go into your Domo and you go into admin and you look at your users and you go into the user table and you see certain values. This is not everything that you can add in the API. So what we did is we looked at these fields as well as a few others and we said, what values do we want to put in there? So the first thing, obviously the Domo user ID is created by them. The email address, they don't get to change. We manage that. We do allow them to have alternate emails, but we don't use that for anything. So it's not a huge problem. But then the title, the department they're in, all of those are linked to groups. So that makes sure they go in the right group. The employee number is actually their employee number from ADP. So that's their file number. We also have employee ID in Domo. For the employee ID, we put the associate ID. That allows us to link our Active Directory with our ADP with Domo. And then of course, locale and location. So location is important for us because in this case we have an actual city and state, but we break things down so we actually have groups for each state and each city as well. So we make sure that everybody has this information in there. All right, so when we want to update our users, so we use this for a couple things. We create our users, we update our users, we also delete users. And then we also add them to groups. So when we want to update our user, first thing I did in SSIS was I created a process that said, give me all of the user IDs from Domo, and then I want the ones where that email address that Domo has does not equal the email address I have in Active Directory. Because if it doesn't match, they're not going to be able to log in. So they won't see their data. So once I had that list, I then take that data and I format it into JSON format, which I'll show you an example of in just a minute. I format it into JSON format, which is pretty straightforward if you've worked with an API before. Most APIs that use JSON format, it's not too difficult, brackets on either end, you have your values in the middle. So you have to format that into a file, and that file is then storing all of your data for the user. So then what we do is I have my list of users now where the email address doesn't match. So I run a query that pulls back the new user ID. And I say this user isn't in Domo. So, or this user doesn't match in Domo. So it puts it into this new user ID update. And this is the exact URL you put into your API execution that will then update that user. So it processes once for each user, and we put all, I believe there's 10 fields that we're feeding in. So we put all 10 fields into that file. So it just takes the file and it sends the file to this URL. So then when we want to create a user, they're not in there. So again, we get all of the users that we have, and then we take our master table that has Domo and Active Directory. So we know they're not in Domo because they don't have a Domo ID. So we get both of those, and then once we have it linked, again, we're now going to we have a created date in Active Directory. So we're piping all of that back into our data warehouse. We look at that created date and say, here's all the people that were created in the last 24 hours. We run this process once a day and only once a day. Again, you have to format the data as JSON, which I'll show you an example of. And then in order to put them in, it's a little different. You're going to use a post method. So you have to make sure that when you are building out your API that you use the post method. And it's, again, we have ours set to do send invite false. We don't want them to get an email inviting them because a lot of times our users get created, and if we send them an email, they may not have been added to a group yet because, again, this process is running once a day. So it only is going to add them to groups once they've been added to our Domo. So it'll go through one at a time, and it'll add all of the new users into Domo. So what does the JSON format look like? Pretty straightforward. This is exactly what it would look like to put me in. I'm already in there, so it's not gonna do anything. If you try and put somebody in that's already in there, it's just gonna give you an error. We have all of our error codes going out to another table. That way I can look at it, and we have a card built that tells me, here's what happened in your API this morning. So when it runs at 5 in the morning and it tries to add all the users, if a user already exists, it'll come back and I'll have on my table or on my card, it'll say there was 2 errors in your API, and it'll tell me what the error was. This user already existed, so we could not create it. So if you were in the API discussion yesterday, and I'm going to caution you right now, this is permanent. So here was one of our pain points. We discovered early on when I was building this out that our HR department has policy in place that if you go on extended medical leave for any reason or temporary leave of absence, they disable your account in Active Directory. So when I built this out, obviously, if you're on extended medical leave, you're going to get removed from our Domo. So I had to sit down with our CIO and I explained to her, are you okay with this happening? Because this means that when they come back, they get recreated, which is fine because they're going to get put into groups, and those groups already have access and their PDP will get created, but it may take a day or two because, again, it has to create the user, then the following day it's going to go through and it's going to say, here's what groups you need to be added to. Most of the time it's not a big deal because it's a new user, a new hire, and in the first week they're going through training. But I did have to make sure they were okay because once you do this, that user is gone from Domo. So I got everybody who was a disabled account in Active Directory. That was the first step. The second one was to match that back to my Domo master list and say, what is their Domo user ID? Everything runs off that Domo user ID for us. So I get those Domo user IDs, and then all I do is say delete. All you have to give it is that user ID. So I put it, again, I'm storing everything into variables, so it's pulling it one at a time for each user. It goes through the table, pulls one user at a time, executes the delete method, and that user's gone. So I'm using, again, SSIS. So this is what my SSIS package actually looks like. So in the case of a delete method, again, you're having to, it's pretty straightforward. You're going to do a direct, or I did a direct URL. I didn't want it to be a variable at all. I am putting the variable into that URL, which is fine. You can do that within SSIS. So all I had to do was put the URL. In this case, what is your method? I've mentioned post, I've mentioned get, I've mentioned delete. There's a couple others that you can do. You can also do a put method, but you just specify what is the method you're trying to use for whatever process you're doing. If you are sending over a create or update or any of those type, if you're doing anything but a delete, your body request is going to be the file. So in this case, I'm not sending it. But if you were going to send over a new user information, you just put that body in there. So in my case, I was saving the file as a variable. You would see that variable, and that's all you would see there. And it pushes that file over. So key data points that we were using. One, obviously, is the name, their name. We had to, as I'm sure you are all aware, a lot of times people have names where they say, hey, I want to go by this. And it's not their legal name. Well, what we have in Active Directory is their legal name. What we have on ADP is their legal name. What they want to see in Domo is not. So we format the name the way they want to see their name. Second thing, we're using Okta for single sign-on. So we had to make it as simple as possible for our users to get into Domo. So by linking in Okta, that was when we realized email address is your key. So we take our email address, again, we make sure that it's the email address that is on, we have 2 email address fields in Active Directory. So there's email address and there's email. Email address is the one that's locked down for us in Active Directory, and that's the one that's actually being used by Okta. So when they go to sign in and they click the single sign-on button, it's going to check their email address and say, do you have access to log in here? We also pass over their office or location information, any region they may be in, into any fields that we have available. We make sure they always have a job title. Always, always, always have a job title. If they don't, we don't push them in. And part of the reason we do that is because it feeds our groups. If I don't know what your job is, if I don't know if you're an underwriter, you will never be in that group and you will never see that page. And that's a big deal. They want to be able to see it very quickly. Again, the employee number and the employee ID. One is associate ID, the other one is file number. They're just 2 unique identifiers within ADP. The associate ID we also put into Active Directory, so that allows us to also link our data. We also put in the SAM account name. Again, another unique identifier. So for us, it was just a matter of getting all of the unique identifiers for one individual user so that we can make sure that when the API runs, I don't have to do anything. And that was the key. I didn't want to have to go in there and say, I need to add Steve in because Steve never got added. So, again, it all feeds back from our single source of truth for our users. So the API is only as good as the data you feed it. And so being a database administrator, that was my big thing. I said, I want my data clean. I want to make sure that what we have before we roll out Domo, the first initial pilot period was to roll Domo out to 500 users in our branches. That's a big rollout for a small team, or at least for us it was. So I said, give me one. I just want one. One table has everything on it, and then I can use that to create all of my users. So that's why I went through and combined all of those data sets. I update that single source of truth every day. So what I'm doing is I'm pulling Active Directory, I'm pulling Domo, I'm pulling ADP, and I'm pulling from, we have a headcount list that gets generated by HR. I pull all 3 of those things in to make sure that the one user, one row per user, has all the correct data on it. For any new users that are coming in, any termed users, because being a mortgage company, we deal with a lot of personal information. So if you get termed at 8 o'clock in the morning, they want your access off at 8:01. So sometimes we do have to manually remove people, but not very often. So again, termed users or any users that get changed. Somebody gets married, they change their name, we need to have it update in Domo, because if they don't see it within a few hours, they start to go, well, that's not my name, and why is it showing up like that? And then, of course, we are using the key user IDs from all our systems. So we also have things like Total Expert. We also have Velocify that we use for our leads and our call center. All of that stuff is coming in because all of our data now is in Domo. So what does my table look like? It's really pretty simple. I didn't make it that complex. So we have our name, again, email address, which is key for us. We have whatever's there in AD for us, or Active Directory, it's called we put the role that they want. Everybody gets created as a participant. And then we can change that manually if we feel they need to be upgraded to a higher level. Phone number, title, location. The locale is just so that they know what language it's in. And then, of course, the employee number, which is their file number, and then also employee ID has their associate ID. All right, so then, of course, with groups, once again, I'm combining. So I'm taking Active Directory, and that's where I create one group for every job title. I create one group for every department. I create one group for every single branch that we have, and I create one group for every single function. We call them function categories, but it would be similar to, if you're in underwriting, we actually have 5 different job titles that fall under underwriting, so it just rolls all those up into one. And then the post method is what you have to use for creating them. The put method is what you use for updating them. And then the delete method to remove them from it. So again, the post and the put method, same formatted JSON file. We don't change anything in that. The only thing we're changing is on that SSIS task that we have. The only thing we change is, are we going from a put method to a post method or to a delete method? We don't have to change anything else. So we made it easily repeatable so that we don't have to go in and recreate it every single time we want to add something in. And then with the group, the only thing we're doing again is the put method. So on the put method, when you want to add a new user to a group, all you have to do with the put method is you just provide the group ID to it in a variable, and you provide the user ID in a variable. All right, so how did we create groups in Domo? So you can link in your Active Directory security groups if you want. We were going to go down that route until we discovered that we don't have an Active Directory manager that can handle it very well. So our groups were a mess. So we would go in there and we'd look and go, well, what in the heck is this security group for? I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this. And so what we decided is that doesn't make sense to us. So once I had a single source of truth that listed all the groups that we wanted and we were going to use, we then created those just in one simple pass. Create these groups. Here's the name I want for them. It creates the groups for you. It gives them a group ID. We didn't have to do anything else. All we wanted was to create the groups. Once we had that, then we can use the API to add to those groups. Because once you get that group ID, that's really all you need. You need the group ID, and then within the URL, and if you go on to the developer.domo.com, log into your instance there, and you can look at the API references on there. It's really, really simple. All you have to do is in the URL, there's one spot to put in the group ID, there's one spot to put the user ID. So in our process, it loops through one at a time, all of our users, and adds them one at a time to the group. We can also remove groups from the API. So there's also a way where you can put in there and you can say if this user is no longer going to be in this group, it's just like with the other ones where you're deleting them from the group. So you can actually put in, there's an option you can say to either add or remove them from the group. So then what we did is we said, all right, now we've got groups, now we're automatically managing this. The database administrator does not have to be in there every single day adding or removing users and doing all of this. So what we did is we put out a policy that said anything you create must be shared with a group. You can't share with individuals, right? Because that was going right back to our silos. If I'm sharing something with one person and me and that person are talking about it, we can't manage that very well. At least not automatically, I can't manage that. So what we said is build everything with a group in mind. Even if it's a small group, that's okay. Just build everything with that group in mind. So that way what we can do is once they build something and they share it with a group, when you get hired at our company and you get hired as an underwriter, within 2 days, you have a fully functioning underwriter dashboard available to you with all of your data. You may not have any data yet, but it's there. It also allows us, when you get removed from a group, those pages automatically go away from your Domo. So we don't have to worry about, well, we moved you from HR and now you're over in payroll. We don't have to worry about any sort of overlap there. You no longer see all the HR data, you're now seeing the payroll data. And again, everything is based on those groups, so we make sure that those groups are clean and accurate. So, putting a user in a group. So when you do our get and put method are the two key ones for managing our groups. So again, you have to get. And the get is giving you this ID. The ID number is the key part of this, right? That's how I know what group it is. It'll tell me how many members are in it. It tells me the name of it. This is our sales team East, right? And then, of course, is it a default group and IDs. So I can pull all this information out and get the group that I'm trying to get to. From there, the first part is your Domo group number. So this is the actual URL that you're going to use. You just use the put method. You don't have to pass JSON through to it in this case. You put in, here's our user, here's our group ID, and then at the end you're going to put your user ID. And it's going to take that user and it's going to add them right into that group in Domo automatically for you. So in order to execute this whole thing, again, I'm using SSIS. You can use other methods. I'm SQL Server guy, Microsoft, so this is what I like to do. So all you have to do is pass the information in like this. The key about the API is that part of your HTTP headers that you have down at the bottom, you'll see the authorization, the third line there. When you create your Domo keys, your API keys through the developer portal, it's going to give you your token and your credential for it. That has to, or your password and your ID. So that has to be passed in. We use that to pull the token, and then the token gets stored into this user access token. That token is what allows us to access the API and push our data back and forth. So all we're doing in this case is we're pulling our groups. So we just say, give me the groups, get them all for me. I limit it to 500 at a time. There is a limit to how many rows you can pull at one time, so I do it 500 at a time, and then I step it through if I need to. So if you need to do that, if you do have a lot of groups, We don't. We're below 500, so I only have to run it once. There is a way where you can say, do it in chunks of 500, and then you can cycle it through where it goes, give me the first 500, give me the second 500, and so on. So there's a way to do that. In addition, we have how my package looks for when I'm trying to put those users into the groups. So as you can see, I have the two variables, the user group ID and the user ID to add. So I put both of those in there, still passing through the user token since you need that to authenticate. These run really quick, and again, I don't have to manage anything. All I'm doing is managing the tables in the data warehouse and making sure that they're correct and accurate. So there are 4 different fields right there that are groups within Domo. Every single thing you see there corresponds to a group. So all of those departments are departments in our company. They each have their own group. If you're in that department, you have access to that department's stuff. If you're designated as a manager, you get put into the manager group. If you're not, you don't get put in there, obviously. And then again, same thing with the title. We have underwriters, you have VPs, you have central processing leads, you have various different roles within the company, and all of those roles do have their own groups. Mostly because we have people that share a lot of the same titles, and we do have pages that are specific to a job title. And then, of course, there's the job function, which is what broad category of job do you fall under. So we run it once a night to update the data warehouse. So the API is running to pull the data from Domo and say, what's the current state of Domo today? And then it's running again to say, what's all our active groups? So if we delete a group from Domo because we decide it's not useful, that night it's going to disappear from my source table and it's no longer going to be managed by the API because it doesn't exist anymore. Whenever we want to add a new group to Domo, we then, once we've identified, so part of the first slide or earlier slides I was showing you about our project flow, right? So once we identify a new group, we create that group ad hoc. We just go into Domo, we create the group. Usually it's for a specific project because all of our other groups are automatically created. We do make sure that the project manager tells us what's the criteria for users in that group. So if you're looking for a subset of underwriters, maybe you're only looking for the underwriters in one particular office and we don't currently have a group that does that for you, you can say, well, I only want all the underwriters that are in Bellevue, Washington. Okay, well, I'm going to create a list of all the users in Bellevue, Washington. Once the group's created, I'm going to have that API execute to update all those users and add them to the Bellevue, Washington underwriters, or whatever they decide to name it. So then what we do is we only do our cleanup of disabled users once a week. Now why I say once a week is because the way that they're doing the Active Directory management is a lot of times they don't term users, they tend to wait till Fridays. And we also do this just because sometimes they will term a user and they don't notify anybody for 2 or 3 days. I know it sounds really weird, but sometimes that's how they do it. They go into their office and say, pack up your stuff and leave, but then they don't tell IT, hey, by the way, can you disable these accounts? So once a week, we're running one that just checks for that entire week. Did anybody get disabled in this entire week that for some reason we missed? And then we run the exact same API, the exact same steps and processes to go through and remove those users. So then PDPs, that was the final thing that we had to solve for, and we had a lot of PDPs. They wanted one PDP for every single user in the company, to include roll-up PDPs. So if you're in a branch, they wanted that one branch to have one for all their users as well. That created a lot of problems for us. You've got users, you've got branches, you've got job functions, you've got locations. All of them, they wanted their own PDPs, and then we were going to have multiple data sets. They wanted these PDPs applied across multiple data sets. And for me, that was a lot of work. So I said, well, I don't want to do all this, right? This is going to be a lot for me to build this and then set it in there. So what I did was I created one, and this is exactly what it looks like. What do I want that policy to be named? What column is that filter going to be applying to, right? So in this case, we did branch number. What value does it need to be filtering on? And then of course the user group, in our case, we were putting in email addresses because email address is locked down, and that made it easy for us to find one individual user. Rather than the Domo user ID, we just used email address. Works the same for us. You can put them in with either one, but this is how we did it. Yep, and there's that slide again. All right, so standardization of the new project pages. So what we did is with those 25 key metrics that I mentioned that we identified, what we do now is whenever a new project comes in, we compare it to our project management team, not me, compares it to our existing cards and pages. Does something already exist out there already? Is it just not shared with your group? Why is it not shared with that group? So they look at that first because we don't want to just keep building stuff because one department wants something and they don't realize it already exists somewhere else. All of our page filtering is standardized unless for some reason you're in a business function that won't be using it. So for example, if you're not touching loans, you're not going to have the same page filtering on yours because you're working a different function. But across most of our company, because most of our users, out of our 2,500 users, only 500 are in our corporate office. The rest are all out in individual branches. So we made sure that their page filtering is standard. So across the top, it has the loan type, it has the loan program, it has the loan purpose, it has what channel did it go through. It has all of those key fields across the top and everybody sees the same page filters. So when you're on the phone talking to somebody at the home office and you want to filter, everybody knows you're filtering by the same exact value and we've standardized all that data. So then of course, we tell them, identify your group structure for us. Again, I pound this into their heads. So I've got our project management team, it took a little bit of time. They didn't see the value in this for some reason, and I said, identify the group. Who is the group of users that's going to be using this? Because that's what's important. I need to know what group I'm putting users in so that when you share your project card or your project page out to all of those users or to that group, all the correct users get to see the data from day one. And then of course, identify all of our PDPs for me. So if there's something specific, we leverage all our PDPs for the most part are created. So it's just a matter of which ones do we want. Hey, give me the branch PDPs. So then all I have to do is sort by all the PDPs that are identified as a branch PDP, and then I apply it to that data set. So I identify the data set, it might be branch loan data, and I apply those PDPs to it, and I run that after hours because sometimes that can take a little bit of time to apply a lot of PDPs to a data set. When you're applying like 2,000 at a time, it can take a little bit of time. All right, so existing card standardization. So most of the cards I didn't build. As a matter of fact, I didn't build hardly any of them. So we had report builders, we've had subject matter experts, we had people that look at it and go, I hate these colors and I want them different. We had people that said, I hate pie charts and I don't ever want to see a single pie chart. And I said, it's up to you. It's your data, it's your card, it's driving your workflow. So, but what we did do is we said, look, this is what we want to make sure that you're keeping with. If we already have one, in this case, a workflow card, they wanted to know what the loans were, what the status of their loans were in each stage of that loan. So was the application started? How many of those are overdue, right? Like have they been sitting there for 15 days and you haven't submitted it for processing? What's going on, right? That's money sitting on the table for our company, and so they wanted to know these things. So they build these cards out. We have color rules on them. We have a bunch of other things that's running through it, but we make sure that this particular card, when we say, this is the workflow card, so when they come in and they say, we need a workflow card, we go, well, we already have one. So what's different about your workflow that's not this workflow? And then we make them change the name to it. So it doesn't just say workflow on the new card. If it's a processor workflow and they don't want to see anything past resubmittal, they don't see anything past resubmittal, but it doesn't affect this card. Yep. There we go. All right. So our page filters, this is, if you go on to any of our pages and you look at it, of course, I'm logged in as an administrator. So I see all of our company filters, and right now it's showing you all rows. So I can pick one PDP policy if I want to see what their data is. So if we do get a ticket coming in that says, hey, I'm in there, I don't think your API worked. And I do get those tickets where they try and say that it didn't work. So I go in, I take a look at the PDP and I go, no, your PDP is working, there's just no data. So until you do something, nothing's going to show up. But we made sure that this is what they see across the top of all of theirs. So all of this is controlled through our data set, through the data set that says this is our page filtering. We do remove some. There are some times where there's fields that they go, well, this doesn't matter to me. I'm not looking at branch number. I'm not looking at loan officer. I don't want it on my page. It's just clutter. Why is anybody clicking on it? That's fine. We remove them. And we're fine with that. We just tell them this is your starting point, right? And you should start with this so that way we know you have that data set connected up correctly. And then of course, in some cases they add fields in. So if they're in a certain department and that department might have a different process, or they may need to filter their data slightly differently than other departments do, which happens quite a bit. Unfortunately, some of our business users will go into Domo and say, yeah, this is great, and we've got this wonderful card, and you've got groups for it, and you've got all these PDPs, and you joined up our filtering data set, and everything's running smoothly, and everything's great, but I need to be able to filter an entire page by something different. So we will add some on there, and in some cases, some of our users have gone a little overboard. We do have some pages that have 20 page filters on them. I don't know that you need 20 page filters, but they feel they need 20 page filters. So they're on there. Again, they start from this. We allow them to add or remove if they want, but this is the starting point on every project page that gets created. So for us, it was all about standardization. So it was minimize the number of page filters and the number of columns you're filtering on as much as possible. If you don't need to have something in there, don't put it in there. You're going to confuse the users. In our case, some of our users still to this day, I get questions. As a matter of fact, just yesterday, as I was walking out of a breakout session, I got an email from one of our users saying, hey, how come this person can see my dashboard? And I went, well, what do you mean, how can this person see your dashboard? And what she was looking at is at the very top of the page, it shows where you have all those little circles for all the people that a page is shared with. She saw his face. And she's like, well, I don't want him seeing my data. So I had to explain again how our process works and said, we automatically control all the data. So when you're logging in, you see your data, he's not seeing your data. He sees his data. But we made sure that everything was standard, right? So by doing all of this, we can make sure that when we get those questions, we already have an answer for it, and we don't have to go doing a bunch of research and say, well, what do you mean he's seeing your data? So our group structure, this is what our groups look like. We try to name certain things a certain way. So all of our groups that are going out to our branches, we put BM in front of them. That's so that we know that this is a branch manager group. We have some branches that will say, hey, this is an awesome dashboard, everything's great, and I want my admin assistant to see it. Oh, but I don't want her to see the financial portion of it. I don't want her to see any dollars. I just want her to see numbers so that she can help me manage my loan officers. So we just, again, all of these are the groups that we created. We, of course, have several more than these. And then what we do is when we're sharing our dashboards or any dashboard, we go in and we just select the groups that we want to share it with. Here's the groups, share this page with them. And we let our users do that. If you're the owner of your page, we allow you to pick what group you're going to share it with. Of course, your name is on that page as the owner. So we kind of put it back onto our users to say, we'll manage your groups, we'll manage your users, we'll manage your PDPs, but you're managing what you build and who you share it with. So if somebody's seeing something you don't want them to see, that's going to come back to you. And you're the one who's going to have to make sure that the wrong group didn't get shared to your page. So basically, kind of wrapping this all up, so the big key thing that I did was, of course, master tables. I used a database. I put everything into my database. I'm pulling from all my different sources. I'm putting them all into my database. I'm running stored procedures and ETL processes on that data to get to clean master sources of data for PDPs, for groups, for users, for everything. So then all I have to worry about are two tables at the end of the day. Those two tables are for PDPs and groups. The user one, I don't really have to look at hardly at all. The reason why we have to update the group and PDP ones are because in the groups, a lot of times new projects come out, they want a new group, it's not supported by existing functionality, so I have to write new code for a new ETL to identify the users that are supposed to go in that group. Same thing with the PDPs. A lot of times they'll come in and say, hey, we want this new PDP, but it's very specific, and we need to make sure these are the only people that get put into these PDPs, and so those are the only two tables that I ever actually go into and update. The other tables, I just monitor to make sure they're good and nothing's breaking. Our API package runs automatically. I don't touch it. The only time that I touch that package is if they make a change to the API. They haven't made one yet, but they do have a disclaimer. If you go into the developer.domo.com and you look at the APIs, they will tell you these are subject to change. So if they do change the APIs, then I would go in and make a change to it. But I have yet to see them make one, but I'm not saying they won't. So that's the only time I have to go in and change it. It runs automatically. I get an exception report that says if something went wrong and what went wrong with it. And so I can go in there and I know exactly what the error code was. So the API does give you back error codes, and I have those, again, stored in a table. That's how I know what I need to do. So this allowed us to do seamless rollout. So when I say seamless rollout, essentially what we're doing is on my end, all I'm having to do is get from the project team, what's the group? What's the users that go into that group? What are your PDP policies that you want identified? I build out the PDP query. I then apply those PDPs to the data sets, and then all those pages are shared with groups. So by the time that our project team says this page is ready to go, usually they will have identified a pilot group, which eventually gets deleted. But they'll create a pilot group and they'll say, well, here's our subset of users that is our pilot group. When it gets shared out to the pilot group, they already have their PDPs set, they're already in the group, everything's already built for them. All they have to do is log into Domo, look at it and go, yep, this meets my use case. This meets what I want. So I don't have to touch Domo. I am in Domo quite a bit, but not doing user management, not doing group management. I only have to go in there when a new project comes along and it's not supported by traditional, or I say traditional, not always traditional, but it's not supported by the existing code that I've written. So if my ETL process doesn't capture what they want for their group, then I have to go in and I have to actually manually change something. But for the most part, the API has not been touched in over a year. So that's basically what I did in a nutshell to try and get us from 0 to 80 miles an hour as quickly as possible. And it allowed us to roll out to 500 users in the first 6 months. And within the first year, we were out to all 2,500 users. And now we have our 30 pages with our over 300 different cards on all of those pages. So, are there any questions? I think Jared has the microphone back there.
Go ahead, who has the question?
It's going to make you work, Jared.
I can do this.
Hey, sorry. Carlos with Academy Mortgage, and I mean, everything you went through is something that we went through also, and it's just interesting seeing that, you went through the same things. But we are using standardized filters for every page, and we find it kind of annoying to have to hide, because you have to have a card on the page for the filters to work. Do you have another way around that? We kind of put it in a collection and shrunk it and tried to hide it somehow, but...
So what we did for our page filters is we actually use a join, an ETL, within Domo that takes our standardized page filters and then puts it onto all the data sets. So with page filters, as long as that field exists on every data set on all of your cards, it'll work. So if you don't have that field in one of your data sets, that's why we add it. So we just created that standard one that says, well, even if you didn't put it in your requirements, all of these fields get added to all our data sets. So that way, you click once, it filters everything. If that makes sense. I hope that answered your question.
I may need to talk to you later.
Okay, no problem. Is there anybody else? Anything at all?
Okay, another question kind of related to customization and maybe CEOs and maybe people who are looking at all of the information. Mm-hmm. Something in our use case, we have maybe 300 different properties, and people see that at varying levels. So you couldn't just say like group one has this set. It might be, it's kind of, if we were to do custom groups, we'd end up with a bunch,
right,
unmanageable amounts. Do you ever run into that, like where someone's trying to look kind of across the PDP roles that you've set up, or do you just handle that with a new group?
So yes, that's actually, that was one of our pain points that we ran into that was pretty difficult for us to solve for. So what we did was we said if we needed to get that granular with something, which tends to come up more than we thought it would, but if we need to get that granular with something, we tried to find, we didn't want to always create a new group because then you were going to end up with a lot of groups and it was a lot to manage. So what we did instead is we said, okay, why do you need to get that granular? So that was the first thing we did is we went back to the project team and asked them, why do you need to get that granular? If it was something they absolutely had to do, we said, well, can you do this through allowing them to have their existing data and just add one new filter in? And then we can then say, okay, that's going to be the default filter, say, for this page. So we would do things where on that data set or maybe on the cards on that data set, a filter was turned on by default that would filter it down to what they wanted to. Otherwise, we would have ended up with way more groups than we have today and way more PDPs than we have today.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. We went through all of these kind of things. I work for L'Oréal at global level. I'm just wondering if you know if there's a way to kind of put in place a process to manage access permissions via a workflow or something like that. So for example, if you have a data set with a high-level security data, and you need someone who is the manager of this data to approve the access of this data to someone who is supposed to be a part of the group.
Okay, so like what was our process for how we managed who got to see what and who made the determination on that? So what we did is for each department, we identified individuals who had that exact role. So we would say, if you're the VP of compliance and somebody, we have a new project and they want to share data and they want to share compliance data, and of course we have sensitive information about all of our borrowers. So there would be times where they would say, well, I want the data to all of our borrower information, and we'd say, whoa, time out, no. You have to get permission first. So what we did is we just had a policy documented that we sent out to everybody that was going to be in Domo, that was going to be sharing anything, and we made sure it was very visible. We actually have a page in Domo. It's one of the first pages any of our users see that explains for them, if you need access to something and you're not sure why you're not getting access, again, if you're on a card and it has a little button that says request access, all of our data sets have owners. And they're not me. So when they do request access, it sends off a buzz followed by an email to that owner and says, this person wants to see your data. So then they just come to us if it's like an ad hoc request and they say, hey, this person isn't in the group, but I want them to have access to it. Those are one-off requests that we handle manually. We don't have an automated process for that. We just have a policy that says, we'll do it, but the VP or director has to tell us to do it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Oh, we got a bunch all of a sudden.
I am new to getting exposed to Domo, likely not going to go live until October-ish. So I'm trying to get ahead of the curve here a little bit. This presentation seems to be geared very much towards security management. Are there other things that you do from a support perspective that take a bunch of time, or is this the primary?
So this is the primary thing that was taking most of my time. One other thing that we were running into a lot of, especially because we were migrating people away from their silos of data into Domo, one of the things we run into a lot is people will say, my card's wrong, the data's wrong. And all we would get is, the data's wrong. And because I was the one putting all the data in Domo, it always came to me. So what we did is that's where we shifted things away from us being the owner of all the data sets to an actual subject matter expert. So we got a lot of that. That was probably the biggest amount of our tickets that we were getting in when we first started rolling out Domos. People said, well, wait a minute, my admin assistant told me that I took 5 locks today, but Domo is telling me I took 4, so you're missing one. And we would have to go, no, we're not missing one. And so by shifting it back to the owner, and in that case it was our lock desk. So we shifted it to them, and then the lock desk would say, no, that's not true. You thought you took 5, but one of them got canceled the same day. And then, oh, that's right, I forgot about that. So that alleviated me, because that was ton of tickets on that, a ton. People questioning data.
I have a question outside Domo. Just wondering if you can share your go-to-market plan to train like over 2,000 people or 2,000 users.
If I can share my plan of how we did it?
Yes, how you do, how you do exactly that.
So what we did exactly to get out, so all of our users, or most of our customer base, is branches. We're an independent mortgage banker, so we're supporting branches. So to go to market, what we did was, once we had, our project plan was laid out in the format of identify all of those customers or users that were going to be in it. Our project managers do waterfall, so they had this whole plan and this whole Gantt chart laid out for us that said, here's the flow of what we're going to do and how we're going to get there. And the only thing that I did on that plan was to just go into them and say, well, I want to manage all the users and permissioning before you ever roll anything out. Because if I keep all the users and permissioning locked in, when you're ready to roll, all you have to do is share it to that group, and you know that the data's locked down and the groups are good to go. So I just had them move that to the beginning of the project instead of wait until after all the cards and pages were created. Hopefully that answers it.
another question.
Hi, I was wondering if you, with the announcement that they made yesterday about the user attribute based PDPs, is that something that you've already approached and developed a plan for implementing, or has it affected your thought what's your thought process on that?
Actually, that's a really good question. So we're part of the beta program, and so the trusted attributes that they were talking about and the dynamic PDPs, all of that was made active in our instance about a month ago, I believe, or so. So I've been starting to look at that, and it is a game changer. I'll be honest with you. I was excited when I saw that and it coming out. Now you can lock down more attributes. Being able to lock those attributes in Domo and then to be able to use that attribute to build a PDP so that when you go to a different data set, you can just say, give me these PDPs, and it just adds them all to it. So we've started playing with it. We haven't fully implemented it yet because we built all of this out. But I have a feeling that that's probably going to change most of this process. So that was a great feature they rolled out, and I think it will change it.
And as a follow-up, if you would like to be on some of the beta programs, make sure you reach out to your customer success manager. They can probably get you on some of those other betas as they come out.
Which I highly recommend.
Okay, other questions? Okay. Can we give Steve another round of applause? Appreciate him.
Thank you.